Tanks, missile systems, and tens of thousands of troops facing Ukraine from the north and the south. Billed as a series of routine exercises, it was in fact one of the biggest mobilizations of Russian forces in decades. Moscow was making no effort to hide it.
In any conflict situation, Mr. Putin tries to recall Western counterparts that he can easily burn the planet.
And then, just a few weeks later, it was all over, just as suddenly as it began. Russia's defense ministry announced all troops would return to base, and all this without an obvious outcome to its original military buildup. So what exactly is Russia doing? Why this huge show of force from Vladimir Putin? Let's find out.
Number one, it's about Ukraine. I mean, it is about frustration in Moscow with Zelensky and the expectations in Moscow that he would make concessions. But I do think it's also a test to see the reaction of the West, and in particular the Biden administration, and just a way to remind people that Russia is here. Russia is militarily strong. Certainly compared to Ukraine, and Russia is in principle willing to use military tools.
Certainly there was no shortage of attention and demonstrative shows of respect for Putin under Biden's predecessor Donald Trump. Their ultimately fruitless summit in Helsinki reminded many observers of 1970s Cold War diplomacy, rather than a meeting between the leader of a superpower and a country whose economy is more than 10 times smaller.
When Trump was elected, that in Moscow, people were popping the champagne corks, and when Biden was elected, that certainly didn't happen at all. And I don't think he expects to get what he got out of Trump, who said that basically he trusts Putin more than the U.S. intelligence services.
This new US president is a veteran not only of the Obama administration, but also decades on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and he soon struck a very different note.
So you know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
This drew a response strident even by the Kremlin standards.
Кто как обзывается, тот так и называется. Мы всегда в другом человеке видим свои собственные качества и думаем, что он такой же, как и мы.
It seemed like one short "I do" from the new US president had really stung, in a way that many rounds of sanctions hadn't. Not in personal terms, but because it suggested something broader. An attempt to isolate the Kremlin diplomatically, a suggestion that here was a leader the West couldn't and wouldn't do business with. Within days, Russian tanks were rolling. First in small groups, still passed off as regular exercises, then progressively more, causing former NATO generals to worry out loud about the growing threat of a Russian incursion into Ukraine.
I think that there probably were various scenarios. I'm not sure that they, from the very beginning, decided we're absolutely not going to attack under any circumstances.
In my vision, the main goal of these exercises was to make a new bargain chip for the West. And this bargain chip will be the possibility of a big war in Ukraine.
Politics, and not a perceived military threat from NATO, was behind these troop movements, says Alexander Goltz. He's convinced it was actually Russia that forced NATO to truly engage with Ukraine by launching hostilities back in 2014.
It's absolutely clear that NATO military started their deployment after 2014.
Ukraine called up its reservists and troops and repeated mantra-like that they would not let themselves be provoked into shooting first. They were desperate not to give an excuse for Russian military action. But many civilians in eastern Ukraine had their cases packed to leave in a hurry if needed. Meanwhile, US legislators advocated to increase support for Ukraine's military to $300 million a year. And crucially, that support would now likely include lethal weapons, not just the defensive equipment previously provided. Something Ukraine has been pushing for years, unsuccessfully. European leaders, such as France's Emmanuel Macron, who had previously tried to engage with Russia and mediate, suddenly struck a more decisive tone. Europe, he said, would not tolerate any new military action on Ukrainian territory. Crucially, though, Europe shied away from spelling out what price the Kremlin would pay for intervention in Ukraine, and there was no promise to halt construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as many in Ukraine had hoped.
Организаторы любых провокаций, угрожающих коренным интересам нашей безопасности,
пожалеют о содеянном так, как давно уже ни о чем не жалели.
Vladimir Putin's eagerly awaited annual State of the Nation address. It had a lot of swagger for lawmakers, but surprisingly little detail on the one issue occupying minds around the world. Ukraine was barely mentioned. The next day, Russia's defense ministry announced the end of the quote exercises, saying that all forces would now return to base. But what has this costly escalation actually achieved?
It's no doubt that all these attempt of bargain was very successful. Biden called. Biden suggested meeting. So now who will say that Mr. Putin is isolated dictator? For God's sake, everybody wants to speak to him.
I think that actually Moscow has come out of this feeling stronger, like it was probably worth it. The military instrument is also something that the West is very reluctant to respond to in kind. So it's kind of an ideal instrument and one where Russia believes that it's strong, it's willing to use that strength, both in terms of show of force and in terms of actual military actions.
The West's unwillingness to use force, the argument goes, could actually now be encouraging Vladimir Putin to use it, or at least threaten to. Russia's neighbours, chief among them Ukraine, are now calling for the West to make Vladimir Putin pay a long-term political price for this piece of brinkmanship. Otherwise, they say, Europe will have to get used to this kind of diplomacy.